It's April 14th, 1865. You're sitting inside Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. For the first time in years, people are smiling, laughing, as if the weight of a nation has finally been lifted. On the stage, actors perform the hit play Our American Cousin. And for a moment, everything feels okay. You glance up for just a moment. There, in a flag-draped box, sits Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States. A line hits, harder than the rest, and the audience erupts. No one pays any attention to the man moving quietly throughout Ford's Theater. The play continues. Another joke. Another burst of laughter. A perfect moment. For a moment, no one moves. Was that part of the play? Then, movement. A figure leaps from the box onto the stage, screaming, panic. You look up. Lincoln is slumped over. The man shouts, "Six Semper Tyrannis!" And the theater erupts into complete and utter chaos. And just like that, the man who held the Union together is dying. But to understand how this moment could happen, how a president could be shot in a crowded theater, you have to go back to the previous 4 years, to a nation tearing itself apart. Because this moment didn't start in a theater. It began years earlier on fields soaked in blood. Before the laughter, before the applause, there was war. A war where brother fought brother. Where families were torn apart. Not by distance, but by ideology. From Antietam to Gettysburg, to the burning streets of Atlanta, America wasn't just divided, it was destroying itself. For decades, the cracks had been forming. Compromises were made to hold the country together, just a little longer. But with each compromise, the divide grew deeper. North and South weren't just arguing over policy anymore. They were arguing over what the nation was and what it should become. And at the center of it all was slavery. An issue so deeply rooted, so fiercely defended, that neither side was willing to back down. Then came 1860, the election of a politician from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. To many in the South, his victory wasn't just political, it was a threat. Within weeks, states began to leave the Union, one by one, forming what would become the Confederate States of America. The country was fractured, and just like that, debate turned into something far more dangerous. War. Fort Sumter, April 1861. The first shots rang out, and any hope of a peaceful resolution vanished. What followed was 4 years of unimaginable destruction. Fields turned into graveyards, cities burned, and families were forced to choose sides. Brother against brother. American against American. A nation at war with itself. And as the war dragged on, the cost became almost unimaginable. Antietam, more than 20,000 casualties. Chickamauga, 34,000 casualties. Gettysburg, over 50,000. It was slaughter, on a scale that the country had never seen before. And still, it continued, year after year, battle after battle. Until finally, in the spring of 1865, the end was in sight. The Confederacy was collapsing. The Union was winning. And in Washington, a wary president, fresh off re-election, prepared to speak to a nation that had endured the unthinkable. March 4th, 1865. At his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln stepped forward, not to celebrate victory, but to try to heal a broken country. A speech not of triumph, but of reconciliation. Among the crowd that day was a man who saw things very differently. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, watching closely. Days later, on April 11, 1865, from the White House balcony, Lincoln spoke again, this time of the future, of rebuilding the nation, and for the first time publicly, he suggested that some black men, especially those who had fought for the Union, should have the right to vote. Booth listened and grew furious. To him, it wasn't reconciliation. It was a line that could never be crossed. He turned to those beside him and made it clear this would be the last speech Lincoln would ever give. And then it came. April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, when his Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's most formidable force, the army that had given the Union its greatest challenge, finally laid down its arms. The war was, for all intents and purposes, over. The Confederacy had fallen. Washington was celebrating, and on that day, April 14th, Booth learned something. While checking his mail at Ford's Theater, he discovered that the president would be attending that very night. A familiar place for Booth, an actor, a man who knew the building, the entrances, the exits, the timing, everything. What others saw as a night of celebration, Booth saw as an opportunity, and as the city celebrated upcoming peace, he began to act something final that night. The paths of these two men would cross, and the course of American history would change forever. As Lincoln prepared to attend the theater on the evening of April 14th, a broader and even more sinister conspiracy was already in motion. Lincoln was not the only target. Secretary of State William Henry Seward was marked for death by the conspirator Lewis Powell, while Vice President Andrew Johnson was assigned to George Atzerodt. Even General Ulysses S. Grant may have been a potential target, though his departure from Washington earlier that day may have spared him. Together, these coordinated attacks were meant to decapitate the Union government in a single night, throwing the nation into chaos at the very moment it seemed peace had finally arrived. And as the night deepened, Booth put his plan into motion. Earlier that evening, he had already been there, leaving his horse waiting in Baptist Alley behind the theater in the hands of a stagehand. Booth moved in and out of Ford's Theater that night, entering, leaving, and re-entering again. His movements, like much of that evening, are not an exact science. Witnesses placed him at different locations at different times, making his precise path difficult to pin down. At some point, Booth stepped out of the theater and into the Star Saloon. There, he ordered a glass of whiskey. He took a cigar as well, lighting it and paced slowly as he smoked. Cigar in mouth, he returned to Ford's Theater. He entered through the front. He passed the ticket taker, John Buckingham, who instinctively asked him for his ticket before recognizing him as the actor John Wilkes Booth. No further questions were asked. Booth took his place behind the audience and watched for a minute. He then climbed the narrow staircase towards the dress circle, step by step, rising above the unaware crowd below. From there, he moved along the back of the balcony, towards the presidential boxes 7 and 8, joined together, draped in American flags, set apart from the rest of the theater. Guarding the passage was not a soldier, but a servant, Charles Forbes. The man meant to protect the president, John Parker, was gone. He had left his post to go to a nearby tavern during intermission. Booth approached calmly, familiar, polite. He showed something. Most likely a calling card. It was enough. He was allowed to pass. Inside the narrow hallway, he had closed the door behind him. And then quietly, deliberately, he wedged it shut with the wooden bar he had prepared. No one would follow. Ahead of him, another door. Through a small hole, he could see into the box. The president seated. On stage, the play moved towards its crescendo. Booth didn't move. He listened. He waited. He knew this performance. He knew the line that would bring the loudest laughter, the moment when every voice in the theater would rise at once. And as that moment approached, Booth stepped forward. And then the moment came. On stage, Henry Hawks stepped forward, delivering a line he had spoken many times before, a line that the audience and Booth was waiting for. Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dologizing old man-trap. The theater erupted. Laughter filled every corner of the room, and in that instant, no one heard it. Behind the president, the door opened. Booth stepped inside the box, a single shot. A .44 caliber Derringer, raised at point-blank range, and fired. Abraham Lincoln slumped forward, unconscious. The laughter began to falter. Confusion spread, but Booth was already moving. In the box was Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, who were the Lincolns' guests. Rathbone lunged towards Booth. Booth turned, slashing wildly with a large knife, cutting Rathbone in the arm. There was no hesitation now. Booth climbed onto the railing of the box and leapt, 12 feet down, onto the stage below. But as he fell, his spur caught, snagged in the flag draped across the box. He landed hard and awkwardly, his left leg breaking beneath him. Booth did not stop. He rose, limping, but standing, turning to face the stunned audience. Then raising his knife, he shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis!" Thus always to tyrants. The words echoed throughout the theater, confusion turning to horror, and the realization set in. Booth turned and began to move, across the stage, through the chaos. Past frozen actors and stunned onlookers, he made his way into the darkness behind the curtains, out the rear stage door, and into the night, into Baptist Alley, where his horse was waiting. He seized the reins and pulled himself onto the saddle, despite the pain, and rode off into the darkness. Behind him, a nation had just changed, forever. And inside the theater, time seemed to stop. At first, many didn't understand. Then the realization spread, row by row, whisper by whisper. The president had been shot. Dr. Charles Augustus Leal, a 23-year-old Union Army surgeon, was the first medical professional to reach President Abraham Lincoln after he was shot. Leal was sitting about 25 to 40 feet from Lincoln's box when he heard the gunshot and saw John Wilkes Booth leap onto the stage. He immediately ran up to the president's aid, finding him slumped in his chair, supported by Mary Todd Lincoln, barely breathing and without a pulse. They carried him across the street, through the night air, past the stunned crowd, into a small boarding house, the Peterson House. They laid him on a bed too small for his frame, his body placed diagonally across it. Irregular, shallow breathing. Around him, silence. Cabinet members, friends, soldiers, a nation holding its breath. Through the long night they waited, and then at 7:22 in the morning, April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton looked down at him and quietly said, "Now he belongs to the ages." As the room stood in silence around Lincoln's bedside, eyes turned to Andrew Johnson, alive and untouched, and now the man who would carry the weight of the nation. Though marked for death by George Atzerodt, no attempt had been made. Within hours, Johnson would be sworn in as president, the fragile continuity of government preserved even as the country reeled. But beyond that room, the violence had not been entirely contained. Secretary of State William Seward laid bloodied in his own home, brutally attacked by Lewis Powell. Against all odds, Seward survived his wounds. The grand conspiracy and its coordinated strikes mostly failed. leaving Abraham Lincoln as the only victim whose life was taken that night. But even as the nation reeled, the hunt had already begun. Booth fled into the Washington night, riding hard through the darkened streets towards the Navy Yard Bridge. The city had not yet grasped what had happened. He talked his way across. No alarm, no pursuit. Not yet. Beyond the city, he met his accomplice, David Harold, waiting just as planned. Together, they disappeared into Maryland. Through the night, they rode to the Surratt Tavern, gathering supplies left behind for this very escape. By morning, Booth's injury had caught up with him. His leg, broken in the fall, forced them to seek help. They arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. There, his leg was splinted, and the manhunt began to close in. A $100,000 reward was posted, massive for the time. Roughly $2 million today. For days, they moved through southern Maryland, hiding in dense woods, relying on sympathizers who offered food and shelter. Behind them, thousands searched. Soldiers, detectives, civilians. Harold gave himself up. Booth did not. He refused. Union cavalry had tracked them to a tobacco barn on a Virginia farm. The building was surrounded. The soldiers called out, ordering Booth to surrender. Inside, he paced in the dark. He shouted back, defiant and desperate, refusing to come out alive. Minutes passed, then the order was given. The soldiers set the barn ablaze, flames rising into the early morning sky. Inside, trapped in fire and smoke, Booth moved in the flickering light, and then a shot rang out. He collapsed, dragged from the burning barn, paralyzed, and his body failing him. Hours later, lying on a nearby porch, Booth asked the soldiers to lift his hands so that he could see them. His final words, barely a whisper, useless. Useless. The manhunt was over, and with that, the war may have ended, but the peace that Lincoln had envisioned never truly began. His death left a nation without the steady hand that had guided it through its darkest hour. In the years that followed, Reconstruction would unfold without him, harsher, more divided, and far less certain. The promises of reunion gave way to resentment, and the fragile hope for a more unified country began to slip away. In his absence, the struggle over how to rebuild the nation intensified. Questions of justice, equality, and the future of millions of newly freed people were left to leaders who lacked his balance of resolve and restraint. What might have been a more measured path forward instead became a battleground of competing visions, one that would shape generations to come. All of it shaped in part by a single moment, a single shot, in a crowded theater, a ripple that would echo through generations of American history. Thanks for watching.